Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started. My name is Talia Dubovi. I am the Deputy Director of the Global Health Policy Center here at CSIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to do African children have an equal chance? To unveil the Human Opportunity Report from the World Bank. We are going to start out with some opening remarks by Anna Ravenga, who's the Senior Director of the Poverty Global Practice at the World Bank. We are going to have a short introductory video that explains some of the concepts behind this report. We will turn it over to the two report authors, Andrew and Ambar, to walk through the findings and the main messages of the report, and then we will proceed to a panel where we will discuss what these findings mean for a policy audience. And at that point, I will ask a few opening questions, but we are hopeful that you will all participate and ask questions and engage in dialogue. So you have bios of everybody in the handout that you got when you checked in, so I'm not going to walk through all of that now. And I'm going to just turn it over to Anna to get us started.
At the World Bank. I'm really pleased to be here just kicking us off. We are extremely lucky, and I want to start by thanking our host, the CSIS Africa program, for partnering with us and for hosting us in this beautiful room. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion about using our report as background, but really an interesting discussion about equality of opportunity for children in Africa. I want to thank our panelists from Save the Children, from UNICEF, Michael, Ted, and also my own colleague from the World Bank, Chico Ferreira, for agreeing to be on the panel. I think they will share their thoughts with us and motivate what I hope will be a lively discussion. I want to thank all of you who are here, but also those of us who are joining us online. And I think, these days we talk a lot and we hear a lot about income inequality. It's in the news, it's in our conversations. I had my mother ask me whether she should buy and read the Piketty book. I told her it was perhaps a little long, but it's very much in the news. And yet, income inequality, if we focus on outcomes, is something that will always be with us. There will always be differences in what people make. There will always be differences in wealth. Some of it reflect differences in effort, entrepreneurship, or skills. I think what we don't talk as much about, and I think this is one of the things that has been missing, I think, from the recent focus on income inequality, is the much more pernicious kind of inequality that really underlies what we see, which is inequality of opportunity, particularly inequality of opportunity at an early age. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Much of what we see as differences in outcomes at the end of the day start very early in life, and they start with very unequal access to very, very basic services. I think this is one of the most important challenges for policymakers around the world, particularly in poorer countries. And I think our panel, what I'm hoping our panel will do is react a bit to our report, but also really make us think about how do we make progress on this agenda. Now, I think many of you have probably heard about the World Bank's new institutional goals, ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity, by which we mean really promoting the incomes of the bottom 40% of the distribution in every country. Able to help countries build societies with more economic and social mobility, and societies where the productive potential of every person is harnessed, independent of their gender, their ethnicity, or their parental socioeconomic status. So for children in particular, we think what is essential is providing universal access to early childhood development, to education, health and nutrition, basic infrastructure services. And this is key to them developing then into being healthy and productive adults, being able to get good jobs, being able to move themselves and their children out of poverty. So what do we mean when we talk about equality of opportunity? You'll see a report that focuses a lot on that question and then attempts to measure it. And ultimately, it really boils down to very a simple idea, which is that access to key fundamental services like clean water, education, sanitation, health should be equal for all children, regardless of where they're born, what gender they are, how much money their parents make, what education their parents have. And unfortunately, equality of opportunity is still very much an aspiration in many countries. I would even say that it's still not there even in quite high-income countries for some groups of the population. Now, I think if we talk a little bit about Africa, and you will see some of this in the report, if we think about a rural child in a place like Mozambique, we'll see that he or she is only about half as likely to have sanitation in the household as an urban child. If we look at a country like Rwanda, which has made progress in many dimensions, but only 20% of the poorest children have clean water at home compared to over 65% of the richest. And these inequalities are not just unfair. As I mentioned, the consequences of these inequalities play themselves out through a child's life and into adulthood. If you're born poor, if you're born a poor girl in a rural area, in a poor country, you can take a country like Nigeria, your chances of going to school are much lower, your chances of having clean water are much lower, you're much more likely to be stunted, much more likely to be sick from preventable diseases. You will probably be less able to go to school continuously, you'll probably learn less, and you will be trapped in a cycle of poverty. And this is, in fact, very much the case. You will see some numbers today that show that in Nigeria, girls, if you have a rural girl, access to a basic bundle of services is less than 20%. If you're thinking about a boy in an urban setting from a richer household, that access to that same bundle is over 80%. So enormous differences that really condition lives and opportunities, starting from the earliest childhood and well into adulthood. Unfortunately, as I said, it's still very far from a scenario where kids have real equality of opportunity, but there has been a lot of progress, and we really are convinced that working on this equality of opportunity sets the stage, levels the playing field for the future, and will be not just the recipe for more equitable societies, but actually also for more productive and richer societies as well. So it's not just a question of fairness, it's also a question of, I would say, laying the foundations of growth and of smart economics as well. Now, we have used these measures of equality of opportunity in our policy dialogues a lot. We started this dialogue in Latin America, where they have contributed to building a strong focus on equity. We have examples from different countries. I was going to mention one in Argentina, in the province of Chaco, where essentially the municipalities are working to improve public service delivery, and into their monitoring and evaluation tools, they have incorporated these particular measures of equity of service delivery. I think in Latin America, what we found is that approaching the issue of inequality from its very core, from its roots in terms of equality of opportunity, opens the door to a policy dialogue that may otherwise not always be open. People can get very ideological about redistribution, but it's very hard to be ideological when you're talking about access to basic services for children, and you're talking about giving every child the same chance, a fair chance. So this is something we do increasingly in other countries, some in Africa, Zambia, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire. We've done this regional report. We are doing this in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, also South Africa. And we have we compile this data on inequality of opportunity for every region in a very interactive visualized inequality dashboard that's available through our external website. So if you ever just want to check in and look at a dimension of inequality and see how different countries and regions are doing, it's something that's very accessible and very user-friendly and very striking in the results. I mean, we see progress in a number of areas, particularly, I think, health and education, but really, really slow progress in areas such as access to clean water and sanitation. So progress is uneven, and it prompts a question of why that is and what can be done about it. So before I give the floor to Ambar and Andrew, who are the authors of the report and are going to share with us some of their main findings, we do want to show you a very short video that I think illustrates the concept, The concept is a little bit complicated to measure, but actually quite intuitive at its origin. So let's watch the video, and then we will move on to our two presenters. Thank you very much once again for being here today.
Inequality is a major concern around the globe. A recent report by Oxfam calculated that almost half of the world's wealth is held by just 1% of the world's population. Nonetheless, you can argue that some inequality between people is not necessarily a bad thing. In particular, you can think about inequality of outcomes, things like the amount of money a person makes or the kind of job they have, as rewarding effort and superior life choices. But what about when a person's potential to achieve these outcomes is simply determined by the lottery of birth? We call this inequality of opportunity. Characteristics like gender, economic circumstances, geography, and ethnicity can trap large groups of people in poverty and specifically affect access to basic services among children. For instance, only 5% of children in the poorest 40% of households in Madagascar have finished primary school. So what will it take to offer equal opportunities to children born into different circumstances across the world? Bringing a basic set of goods and services to disadvantaged people has a huge impact. Clean water, education, electricity, and sanitation make a tremendous difference in early childhood. As these children grow into working-age adults, their skills, knowledge, and health become essential to getting jobs, accelerating economic mobility, and reducing inequality in the long run. For example, according to the Global Partnership for Education, if all students in low-income countries left school with basic reading skills, it could lead to an estimated 171 million people being lifted out of poverty. Okay, now how do we measure all this? To start with, we track coverage rates and coverage gaps for access to basic services among children. We've also used this data to develop the Human Opportunity Index. For each country, the index measures the availability of key basic services and how fairly they are distributed among the population. So if a country's services aren't equally accessible for different groups of its population, they'd score lower on the index than a country with services available to all. In other words, the Human Opportunity Index is coverage corrected for inequality. You can find out more about inequality of opportunity by exploring our Visualize Inequality dashboard.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for being here, and to CSIS for hosting us. And before I start the presentation, I just want to start by thanking the very large team. And Andrew and I are here representing actually a very large group of people, including people who worked on the data from our central unit, from the regions, and so on. The data that we use is exclusively from the demographic and health surveys. So that's, again, it's a great source of data for looking at poverty, inequality, and access to services. So I'm not going to spend much time on this slide because I think that's what the video was about and what Anna was also talking about. And essentially, we are concerned about inequality of opportunity, which, as you have heard, it's about inequality which is attributable to the circumstances at birth. So that's basically what it is. Now, there are various interpretations of how this type of inequality can be measured. So we have indices, for example, and we have actually one of the authors who has produced some of these indices sitting here, where you can actually estimate inequality of opportunity from incomes itself. So in other words, you take overall distribution of income and you see which part of that inequality is actually attributable to differences between groups. So that's one way of measuring inequality of opportunity. The kind of measure that we are talking about are essentially looking at children and looking at their access to opportunities. We're not trying to be exhaustive. In other words, we do not claim that having access to this minimal bundle of opportunities, which is essentially school attendance, immunization, relatively clean water, improved source of sanitation, not being stunted, that these actually ensure a level playing field for everyone, necessarily. But this is where one starts. This is the basic minimum that everyone should have. And in addition to that, you need much more. But even if we start at that level, what we are going to show you that while progress has been made, there are enormous challenges that you see in the 20 African countries that we have studied. So the Human Opportunity Index is, as the video was trying to show that through a very sort of a quick exposition, but let me just explain it a little bit. So what it is essentially, it is not just about inequality of opportunity. It's coverage corrected for inequality of opportunity. In other words, if you had 100% coverage of a particular service, let's say safe water, the Human Opportunity Index is going to be 100%, right? Or 1 or 100%. If coverage, on the other hand, was, let's say, 50%, and that's where the Human Opportunity Index actually adds value to your normal coverage rate. Because what it's going to do is that it's going to take the 50% coverage rate, and then it's going to measure, then it's going to penalize that 50% for the inequality of opportunity. In other words, the extent to which that 50% coverage is unequally distributed across groups with different types of circumstances. So depending on the extent of inequality or inequality of opportunity, the Human Opportunity Index is going to be less than 50%. So that's what we mean by coverage corrected for equity. So it's an inequality-sensitive coverage rate. It takes into account coverage and whether it's allocated in an equitable way, where equity is defined in terms of whether the groups defined by the circumstances, gender at birth, let's say household income at birth, location, and so on. So these are the circumstances, and these circumstances define groups across which the inequality is measured. Why do we focus on children? And there are two basic reasons, which are really fundamental reasons. One is, of course, the whole question of mobility, which is that inequality of outcomes today is partly a reflection of inequality of opportunity in the past. No matter how you measure those opportunities, whether you measure it by Human Opportunity Index, whether you use a more expanded definition of opportunities, you can very easily see that a lot of the inequality in outcomes today is a result of inequality of opportunity in the past. So there's a whole aspect of mobility when we talk about people moving out of poverty within and across generations. This is one area we have to focus on, the access to basic services and a broader set of opportunities at birth. And secondly, which is of course related, which is the differences in opportunities during childhood, and especially during early childhood, can have lifelong impacts. And this is a problem. This is a point that James Heckman, famously among many others, have made a number of times. And essentially what you find is that interventions early on in life are even cost efficient, because correcting the inequalities at birth later on is actually much more costly and less efficient. So even if you come from a point of a completely sort of, agnostic point of view of cost efficiency and so on, it makes a lot of sense to focus on children. So here is basically the graphical exposition of the example that Anna was giving, which is to what extent does circumstances matter? And here is a quick visual glimpse. So what we're doing is that we are just estimating the probability of accessing, we're calling it a basic bundle of services, relevant for a particular age group, which in this case is 6 to 11 years. And the bundle of services, it's very basic. It's attending school, improved sources of water and sanitation, and we take two different children with contrasting profiles, one a girl of age 6 and 11 living in a rural household, in a poor rural household, and headed by a woman with no years of education, and child B, which has exactly the sort of the opposite profile. And this graph basically shows you what's the difference in probability of accessing a bundle which includes all these three services, okay? And you can see that even just focus on one number, which is Malawi. So if child A, which is the more vulnerable child, if this person were to live in Malawi, she's actually better off in terms of access to these services compared to all other countries. But even in Malawi, the difference between her probability of access to this bundle and that of the more fortunate child is as much as 40%. If you go to some of these other countries, it's as high as 85%. So this is just to illustrate how circumstances actually matter. So what we're doing in the study, we are using demographic health services and demographic and health surveys, DHS, and we have, and it includes 20 countries, which account for about 73% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa. We cannot include all because we need a data source which is fairly recent. We covered the period roughly between 1998 and 2008. There's some variation because of data availability. And for most countries, we have data for both these periods. So what do we mean by opportunities? And again, caveating that we're not trying to be exhaustive. We don't get, there is obviously, this is a very basic set of opportunities we are looking at. So under opportunities, we essentially, the guiding principle is essentially we are trying to find services which society agrees is critical for individual development, and the Millennium Development Goals, which reflect a consensus between countries in terms of what the basic opportunities should be, I think is a useful guiding principle. And these are also services where universality is a valid social objective. So that's kind of one standard we use. So you have these described under education, where we have attendance. We have some proxies for, we don't want to use the word quality so much, but that's what it's trying to get at, whether you start primary school on time, whether you finish primary school by a certain age, access to water, sanitation, and so on. On the right-hand side, you have circumstances, which includes, first of all, child characteristics. Now, of course, DHS is a very rich data set, so it actually lets you identify a whole set of circumstances. So we have child characteristics, we have the composition of households, the location, household head characteristics. We include a variable on parental presence, because in a lot of these countries, especially the conflict-affected countries, it really matters, because orphan status is associated with a lot of different vulnerabilities. And of course, we have socioeconomic status. So just to give you a quick glimpse of some of the results, and I'll start, and then Andrew will take over. So first of all, the positive part of the story, and there are actually a lot of positives. And this graph basically shows, I think, what we take the biggest positive. Simply speaking, essentially for over half of all opportunity, for every country we see improvement, and by improvement we mean statistically significant improvement in the Human Opportunity Index, which means, remember, the Human Opportunity Index improves if coverage increases or inequality goes down, or both. And you see statistically significant improvement in all the countries for at least half the opportunities. The graph basically shows where you see the most improvements. When we look at the opportunity bundle, and that's one way of summarizing a lot of information on different indicators into sort of a single indicator. When we look at the opportunity bundle, one thing that we're interesting to see is that, and this graph essentially shows the extent of improvement, the average annual rate of improvement over a roughly 10-year period. And the bars that you see there essentially shows the confidence intervals, okay? So you want the entire bar to be on the right-hand side of the line, which shows 0, in order for it to be a statistically significant improvement. Now, this you can see that if you take two different bundles, one is for the older children and one is for the younger children, it's for the older children that you see improvements in all countries, almost. You don't see it for younger children. Well, what is happening here? It's basically a product of there being a lot more improvement in school enrollments as opposed to full immunization, okay? Because the bundle for the younger children includes water, sanitation, stunting, and full immunization. And one for the older children includes school attendance and water and sanitation. So the difference is essentially coming from the difference between the progress that you see, which is a lot on school attendance, and I'm going to show that, and the relative lack of improvements you see in some of the health indicators, which include stunting and immunization. We also see convergence. We see gaps between the lagging and the leading countries declining. And there's one way of showing it, which is just measuring the coefficient of variation for the Human Opportunity Index of every opportunity across countries. So the coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the mean. So if the bar goes down, it means there is less variation across countries. And you see this happening for all the indicators of opportunities that we have. Another manifestation of the same, the same convergence story, and by convergence, again, I mean the gaps between the countries which started off in a better position as opposed to the lagging countries, the gaps between them declining, is the gap between Anglophone and Francophone countries. So what you see here, the graph on the left is 1998, difference between Anglophone and Francophone, and you can see the large gaps, with the Anglophones being generally, the leading countries. There's a lot of variation within these groups, so these are averages. And you can see that the gap's declining. And you can see it in many different ways. Whichever way you measure it, you see the gaps between the leading and the lagging countries declining over time. At the same time, the improvements, and I was alluding a bit to that when I was talking about the bundle, the improvements are uneven across opportunities. So you see larger improvements in school attendance, and that's almost everywhere, than in starting primary school on time or finishing primary school by a certain age, which matter for education quality. And there is a persisting issue of low coverage with high inequality of opportunity for infrastructure, where the improvements have been extremely uneven. So this is basically showing that. This is showing you the status in 2008. The bars represent the coverage. The dots represent the human opportunity index. The gap between the bar and the dot is measuring the extent of inequality. Okay, that's the way to look at it. So if you just look at the dots, you can see that, well, actually, it's the dots which represent the coverage, the bars represent the human opportunity index. So if you look at all the bars, you can see that the picture is much better in 2008 on school attendance compared to starting primary school on time and finishing primary school on time. Similar story on access to basic infrastructure. You can see the improvements have taken place, but where we are currently is, first of all, a lot of variation across countries, and frankly, a lot of countries where a small minority of the children are actually covered by even the more basic standards of water and sanitation. A mixed picture in immunization and nutrition. In nutrition, it's interesting, and here we're measuring stunting. Okay, so what you see is that a remarkable degree of consistency across countries, but none of them are near 100%. So there's a big challenge there, but the cross-country variation is less. In immunization, again, it's a very mixed picture. You have countries like Rwanda and Malawi, which have made enormous progress. I mean, not showing the progress here, but they've made enormous progress compared to some of the other countries, including some very low numbers for countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia. We're measuring full immunization. And it actually makes a difference whether you measure just measles or partial immunization or full immunization. All of which, basically coming back to the same point, that if you combine all of this, what you see is relatively low access of the basic bundle of opportunities, and particularly for the younger children, and which is essentially a result of the performance being much better on the education side, on school attendance, as opposed to immunization. Obviously, it depends on how we define these basic bundles. If I were to include starting and finishing primary school in time in the basic bundle, the picture would look quite different.
Hello, does it work? Okay. Okay, so just to take off from where my colleague Amber said, so we obviously think that circumstances matter. So the reason why, in fact, you get these low bundles of services or opportunities is because circumstances matter. And circumstances matter in the following sense. So let me give you a very simple illustration. So take one of those opportunities, right? Let's say access to flush or pit toilet, latrine, right? And let's say you find out that for one country, take one country, and you find out that there's these huge problems of access, and you want to try and understand what is explaining that, okay? So you're trying to decompose what is explaining this lack of access to these things. If you just look at this graph, basically this tells you that, what proportion of that lack of access is explained by these different factors, right? One of them could be that, in fact, the household happens to be in rural area, so that's location. You see green. The other one happens to be maybe the mother is not well educated, or the father for that matter, right? Head of education is low, right? So as you see, for each one of these, there are three that really, really dominate the explanation, and that these are wealth, which we consider to be mostly, well, the wealth here, because it's the DHS, is actually just asset holdings, right? The kind of assets they hold. And one of them is location, which is urban or rural, and the other big one is head of education, the education of the head of the household, right? So if you just look at a specific opportunity, then this is what the decomposition will tell you, right? What we did here is actually take the 10 top most unequal countries and take the averages, and it is still consistent. Those are the three biggest contributors to this lack of opportunities, right? Or the differences in opportunities. However, it's our view that, in fact, policy did make a difference. Right? So now take the opposite example, right? If you happen to actually take a particular country and you wanted to find out between 1998 and 2008, if there was a decrease in the gap, right? If there was some improvement, what explains that improvement, right? So the first picture was a very static one. What explains these differences within a country of a particular year across this population? This one is within the same country, right? What explains actually the progress that they've made, right? And what we find out is that we did this composition for three things, right? So the first one, which we call equalization, is if in fact the opportunities increase proportionately for each particular circumstance group, okay? So that is the blue. And then the orange, I think that's the color, right? It's orange, is actually if these opportunities favored populations that were originally excluded from having access to these opportunities, right? Usually this is the kind of stuff we associate with government action or policy, right? And the third is composition, which is basically that supposing, in fact, that the proportion of, or the share of the circumstance groups change. So for example, let's say one circumstance group, take the example of, that my colleague Amber started with, which is a girl who is 6 years old, who lives in rural areas, and who lives with a mother who has no education. So that's a circumstance group, right, for example. Right? So if the proportion of population in those circumstance groups changes, that will be the explanation in the green bars will be the proportion that's explained by that. And as you can see, the stuff that dominates here is the scale. And the scale is really that these improvements have actually favored groups that were originally excluded from these opportunities, right? So that's the sense in which we say actually that policy mattered a great deal. Now, and these opportunities have actually improved for all kinds of countries, right, as my colleague explained. And you can see here that the graphs that you see on the left basically explain how much, in percentage terms, the opportunities have improved relative to, compared to, say, the GDP per capita, for every level of GDP per capita. And as you can see that, in fact, for countries that have relatively relatively low GDP, there have been a lot of countries that have improved. There are also countries where, so in that sense, you can see that everyone has improved. There's a shift of the graph, the blue graph, to the left. Is it called to the? Yeah, to the left. And that is actually an explanation that, in fact, these improvements have happened across income groups. Not just the rich countries have improved. But what's happening is that, of course, there are big gaps that still exist. One thing that you will see is that African countries have actually closed the gap between, say, countries like Latin America that have improved opportunities a lot for their populations in one dimension, which is school attendance. But in other dimensions that are equally important, for example, in the completion of primary school, that hasn't happened nearly as well. So you can see, for example, these graphs, right, on the left, the graphs for African countries show much larger bars, right? That's, the growth rate in improvement in school attendance is much larger than Latin America. That's because Latin America already has very high levels of school attendance, so the changes are going to be tiny, right? But on the other hand, if you look at completion rates, in Latin America, there have been huge improvements for the same, the same period, or more or less, while in Africa there hasn't been nearly as much. And this is the same story. On the left is basically school attendance, and you can see that in fact the enrollment rates are, converging with Latin America. Africa is the blue bars, and Latin America is the orange bars. And you can see that, in fact, there's significant convergence, especially at the top performers. They're almost similar to Latin America, except, countries like, what's that? Niger, I guess. However, but finishing primary school on time is significantly poorer, much lower for Africa. And it's even worse if you actually, look at things like infrastructure. By infrastructure here, we mean access to electricity. We just give this one example, but access to sanitation, clean water, and so on, right? These are very important sort of inputs to human capital especially of children, because it improves their health and future productivity. So in this case, as you can see, I mean, the distance between the Latin American performance and African countries is even worse than if you look at things like education. And these differences don't go away if, in fact, you control for income, right? As you can see, for example, on the left side, so this will be the HOI, so the Human Opportunity Index is weighted by income levels, right? And you can see that in Africa, except for a few countries like Ghana and Senegal, the rest of them, hardly even, the percent hardly even comes close to half what you see in Latin America, for example. All right, so that basically summarizes, for the most part, the findings of the report. What do we find? So let's recap what we find, right? So there's been much progress that has been made. Whether you consider them across countries, bundle of opportunities, single opportunities, or there have been much progress that have been made. The gaps between countries that were basically better performing and those that were lagging behind has closed, so that's good news. But there is lack of progress, especially in the infrastructure opportunities. There's been progress, especially on education, but substantially much less for infrastructure opportunities. And the most important thing is we also see that, in fact, the opportunities have been much better for older children, but not for the very young children. And what the research in recent years is telling us is that, in fact, the opportunity for younger children is consequential, even in adult life, right? So I think one of the frontier things that the governments in Africa probably need to invest in and do and put a lot more effort in is actually to try and improve opportunities for much younger children going forward. So that summarizes.
Thanks very much, Anna, Andrew, and Ambar for that presentation. And now we will turn to a discussion of those findings. Joining me on stage are Michael Clausen, the Vice President for Policy and Humanitarian Response at Save the Children, Ted Scheiben, the Director of Programs for UNICEF, and Francisco Ferreira, the Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. So, Michael, starting with you, in February, Save the Children published a report, The Lottery of Birth, which looks at similar issues, inequality of opportunity. Could you walk us through a little bit the findings of that report? To what extent do they reinforce what we've just heard? Are there any differences in what Save the Children found?
Sure. No, thank you for that. And I hope everybody goes on our website and takes a look at it. And I was delighted to see that the World Bank is also using the same term, Lottery of Birth, in their report there. I think the good news is that, and as many in this room know, we've seen really dramatic progress in reducing child mortality over the last 20 years. I mean, we've cut in half the child mortality rate, and there's probably 17,000 more children that are alive each day now than was the case in 1990. So the good news is, and again, it is reinforced by what you saw in those graphs, there's been tremendous progress. The challenge is that there's still a lot of children that are not benefiting in that progress. There's another 17,000 children that are dying every day nowadays, 6.3 million roughly across the world, and it's not randomly distributed. It really is based on things like the wealth of a parent or of your parents. It's based on where you live, urban or rural. It's based on maybe the geography of your home, what part of the country you're in, and it's based on your ethnicity, and hence the lottery of birth. And again, I think the Save the Children report has a very similar perspective as the work that our colleagues from the World Bank have done, which is that this is not fair, and it needs to be tackled for a variety of reasons. I think what we'd say is that, so our report took a look at, similarly to the World Bank effort, although we focused really in on the health area. We looked at child survival. We didn't look across a whole set of other sort of indicators for children. And we looked at child survival, and what the report found was that, it used the DHS data, the mixed data, and so forth, and we worked the data with ODI in London. And what the report found was that in about 3/4 of the country that we studied, that at least one group, one group was falling behind, even though there was overall reduction in mortality. Some people were benefiting more than others, so particular groups were being left out from the progress. And in about, I think it was roughly 16% of the countries, all of the 4 groups that we studied, they were, that gap was increasing in all 4 groups. So I think that, that's the bad news, is that we've, in a way, we've cut in half the child mortality rate, but we've actually, there's still large groups where a lot more work remains to be done. So rather than get into a lot of detail, I just simply would say that, as I think our World Bank colleagues saw, finish on some good news, which is that it can be done. There are some policy solutions. There are at the international level, and we can talk about the opportunity offered by the Sustainable Development Goals to tackle this issue. There's opportunities in national policy, and there's certainly programmatic opportunities. And I'm happy to, as we go through this conversation, to get into other areas. So, I mean, good news that progress is being made. Bad news is that groups are being left out. Good news is that there are ways to tackle that. And that's, in a sense, the report.
Wonderful, thanks.
But please read it.
Turning to you, Ted, UNICEF's mission is specifically to reach the most disadvantaged children and the neediest of countries. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit in your work, what have you seen in terms of policy approaches at the local or the national level that is most effective in addressing these inequalities?
Sure. First, let me say thank you for both the report and for this event. I mean, any event that allows us to speak about equity and equal opportunities for children really advances child rights. So it's really appreciated that we're here together today. And there's any number of directions I could take your question, but I want to put a couple of markers down for further discussion over the next hour. And start really by the whole issue of, where Michael left off, which is kind of some of the, what can only be called a revolution in the reduction of under 5 mortality. And what it illustrates as a key approach to making progress, not just in the area of health, but I think across the board, which is really the importance of doubling down on the community approach. And where we've seen progress is in places where countries have decided to invest at community level in decentralizing their services and making those available at the doorstep of families and villages, and deciding that for every 5,000 people, we're going to have a primary health care unit, that we're going to have community schools that are based close to the household, that we're going to allow access to services in a way that's easy and decentralized and equitable. And when you look at some of what's been achieved in the area of health, it's been work on pneumonia, work on diarrheal diseases, work on malaria, work on severe acute malnutrition, and indeed, not full immunization, but measles, and the immense progress on measles. And this has been achieved at community level with health workers focusing on primary health care who don't need an enormous amount of training, but can achieve enormous results. And we can double down on those approaches and systematize them in a way that places that don't yet have those services, can get to those services. That approach is equally true in education. It's increasingly true in sub-Saharan Africa in the area of social protection, which is now a program at scale in many countries. A couple of more points while I have the floor again for further discussion. One is, I think the SDGs offer enormous opportunities, both in terms of the unfinished business of the MDGs, a lot of which we're talking about today, but also in terms of the next generation of issues where we're also going to have equity questions. Issues around obesity, which is going to occur in the same place where we have severe acute malnutrition. Issues around secondary education. We've done a good job getting children into school. They're not completing primary education, and the quality of what they're learning still needs to be addressed. But we're also going to have issues around secondary education. And issues around violence and protection, which were missing in the MDGs and are now in the SDGs. Part of the reason why children don't stay in school is because of issues of violence and protection. And so it's not just decentralizing the service, it's also making it a safe service and an available service for family. Last point, again, to provoke discussion, that I'd like to make is, the data here is from 98 to 2008. There's been further progress since 2008, and some of the countries that look like they have high inequities and where there are serious issues, places like Ethiopia, places like Rwanda, places like Kenya, have actually made enormous progress since 2008. But there's a part of Africa which neither shows here nor today is making as much progress as the rest of Africa. And I think it's a part that we need specifically to focus on, and we have in some ways an opportunity to do so. And that part is that whole part that goes from the Sahel over to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and some of those countries. Sierra Leone having some of the highest maternal and under-5 mortality rates in the world. Terrible tragedy with Ebola. But, as we're getting to zero and moving beyond Ebola, how can we see this as an opportunity to reinvest in systems that reduce inequity, that increase access to services, that build resilience in that part of Africa, which is not well represented in these slides, and which is a part which we really need to focus on if we're looking at issues of equity and equality of opportunity.
Okay, thanks very much. And to you, Francisco, who needs to do what in taking this kind of research and translating it into action? Recognizing that a lot of this work needs to be done at a local and national level, are there specific places that the donor community can push on and really move this agenda forward?
So I'm a big believer, actually, in local and national ownership of these policies. Obviously, I think there is a role for the donor community, otherwise I wouldn't work at the World Bank. But I think the most important actors are those in local government. I mean, the role of community management of health interventions and so on was mentioned, and I think that's hugely important. One of the lessons that I think we can learn in Africa from, for example, Latin America, is actually the importance of a new social contract that can come up and be formed. In Latin America, after democratization took place in the mid-90s in particular, we took states that did very little redistribution, very little, we had what we called truncated welfare states in Latin America, in that there was pensions for people who were already well off, and university education for people who were already well off, but almost no redistribution, right? And with the advent of democracy after the military dictatorships in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and other places like that, these things really did change. And we started hearing about conditional cash transfers or early childhood development initiatives in Chile and other places like that. Those things, to me, are a reflection of a new kind of social contract, without trying to sound too grand about it. There was a redistribution of voice. There was greater empowerment of poor people. And I think as that happened, the state was drawn to provide services to people who previously did not receive them. And I still see some of the demonstrations in the streets that you see in places like Brazil in the last 2 years, or Chile not so long ago, as an ongoing renegotiation of that social contract, as population saying, look, given the taxes that we pay, we don't get services that are good enough at the bulk of the distribution. Africa is still starting in that process. Of course, there's variation across the continent. It's a hugely heterogeneous continent. But I believe that the sort of voice and empowerment of people at the bottom will be fundamental for improved services. We already see some of that in work that has been done around the funding of schools, where you see that just making available the indication of what parts of the budget are flowing from the capital cities to certain schools. There was some quite famous work on that in Uganda. Actually empowers local communities to demand that those schools receive better services, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, there's a role for the donor community, but I think that role is fundamentally in supporting the initiatives of people and governments at local and national levels.
And are you seeing that being done on the ground? I mean, are there changes in how the donor community needs to approach how it's interacting with some of these countries?
That's a good question. I think we see it. not because of the leadership of the donor community, to be completely honest, but where the countries lead. So two good examples of that are countries that were mentioned earlier, Ethiopia and Rwanda, which have their shortcomings in terms of the democratic nature of their governments, but they have governments that are very developmental and pro-poor. And where they are leading those efforts, the World Bank and other donors follow. I think the places where we at the World Bank try to exercise a leadership role is in what my boss, the Vice President for Africa, calls failed and forgotten states. One example is Guinea-Bissau. So we just participated in a large roundtable for pledging roundtable for projects and interventions in Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau is one of the poorest countries in the continent. It has a long legacy of conflict and malfunctioning institutions. And there, I think, some of the interventions that we're engaged in are trying to help the government move in the direction of just any services, to be honest. I mean, this is a place where a year or two ago, there was no electricity for extended periods of time. And teachers were not at school, and so on and so forth. So, and then once there's some promotion of services going on, then extension of those services, of course, to the least privileged and to the neediest. So there's a wide range. I mean, I think what I'm saying is that in most places in the continent, we follow the lead of national governments, which is as it should be. In conflicts that are in countries that are particularly fragile, where institutions are particularly weak, where there's a lot of conflict, then I think, of course, the donor community can step up in a much bigger way and sometimes plays that bigger role. But that's no substitute for actually fixing the institutional fragility, which is what needs to be done.
Thanks. A couple of you have mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, so why don't we turn to that and dig in a little bit more. What opportunities are you seeing with the post-2015 agenda and the development of the Sustainable Development Goals? Are you seeing the global community coalesce around some of the messages that we see in this report? Are your institutions engaging in that process? Are you hopeful for what the outcome is going to be at the end of the year? And Michael, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure.
And then...
Yeah, we're very active in this whole process, and we see a lot of opportunity. It's challenging when you have 17 goals and 169 targets, but that's where we are. And I would say that a couple of points. One, so what we've been pushing for are ambitious goals, and I think a number of these, particularly the targets, are very ambitious. I mean, ending preventable child deaths by 2030. That's a good ambition. Having all kids leave school learning is a good ambition. There's lots more. So we've been pushing for ambitious targets. We've been pushing also for feasible targets. So you want to push people, but you also have to have ways of measuring whether you got there or not. And I think a lot of the targets are at that level of granularity. There's still, I think, some work that's being done to try to make that uniform across all the targets. I would say that what we've really been pushing on, given what this World Bank report highlighted and our report and the conversation up here, is this whole notion, and what is very much seems to be very much in play is this whole focus on inequality. I mean, the first set of MDGs is really just have sheer progress and drive things down, and we've had a lot of that, and now it's kind of going after pockets that have not benefited from that growth. And so we have said that we shouldn't we've been pushing for the idea that no goals should be considered completed or achieved unless it's completed for all groups. And that does seem to, it now has been picked up. So we're quite excited that embedded in the very concept of these goals is this notion of achieving, sort of reducing inequality. The other part, which we have thought as a way to operationalize it, and I think this still we would say needs further work, is the idea of sort of equity stepping stones. So you don't wait till 2030 to see how you did. You put in place some incremental goals over, say, 5 years from now. Have you reduced the inequalities between these various groups vis-a-vis this target? So you have ways of measuring as you're going towards that, and therefore course correcting. So that's something, a way to operationalize this emphasis on equity that we've seen. And I think there, more the jury's out on whether that will make the final cut or not, but it's something we'd very much like to see. And then I would say the just two final points. One is, and it picks up on what Francisco was talking, I really do think that part of part of all of this really is to bring the people that are involved into the process. So you want to see sort of more representative and accountable governance. That really is, I mean, solving some of these social problems is really interrelated with progress in that space. So people who are affected have a way to give voice to their concerns and demand action, if you will. And the final point is, what we've talked about, is data. And I think there's work to be done. We don't want, sort of people who are uncounted, you don't know what's happening, and there's still quite a bit of that. So we have to improve the whole data system so we know where we're headed and how we're going to get there.
Just to add, I mean, there's, first of all, I think equity is explicitly in the SDGs in the way that it wasn't in the MDGs, which was about averages and getting going, as Michael has said. But I also think there's a number of other opportunities that we need to keep in mind, given the topic that we're discussing here today. Firstly is that the SDGs are intended to be universal. Now, I think how member states are going to react to that is still being figured out. But let's assume for a moment, or hope for a moment, that it's truly going to be a universal mandate. Then all of a sudden we're having a discussion not just about what's going on in Malawi or what's going on in Nigeria, but we're having a discussion about what's going on in the UK or what's going on in Japan or what's going on in the US, which I think fundamentally changes the terms of the discussion and the terms of the discourse and frankly the relationships. And I think that's a very important opportunity, which, as I said, is not yet fully worked out, but if it materializes, is huge. We had just yesterday the chief kind of focal point from the German government there, and at least the Germans and the Dutch are saying that they're serious about the universal nature of the SDGs, and that's great. There are also issues in the SDGs that by their very nature are going to be universal. If you discuss violence against children, and you're looking at issues of violence against children, this is not unique to any society. I mean, every single society in the world has issues of violence against children in different forms, in different ways, but it's something that needs to be addressed and needs to be looked at universally. So I think there's a huge opportunity there in terms of both changing the way the discourse is no longer some people who are accountable and some people who are involved in the discussion without being implicated in the discussion. It's really everybody, I think, is engaged. Two more points. Firstly, I think the whole concept of sustainable development goals, I think, and the sustainability issue, bringing the whole, climate change adaptation element is again going to be something that's going to be essential. So it's not just, the how becomes as important as the what. So it's not just a question of getting to the finish line. You have to do so in a way that's sustainable. And then lastly, I think we should look at the events that are going to make up this year's calendar. So obviously, in September, it's very important. But starting with Addis, the Addis Ababa on financing for development, the Addis Ababa conference in July, it's huge because that's really about domestic financing to a great extent. It's really about what can be done with budgets, what can be done with existing resources within countries, again, to go back to the point about country leadership and national leadership, what can be done to advance these goals. And if we can have this discussion universally, and again, I think the verdict's still out, that's even more exciting.
Just two very small points. I think what my fellow panelists have said, I have little to add. I mean, one, just to reiterate a point both of them already made, which is I think the primary difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, and where I do think it's progress, is the emphasis on distribution, right? So the MDGs were all about averages in some sense, and the SDGs are more explicit, considerably more explicit in looking at distribution. I don't think that's only the sort of fashion. Anna was referring to Piketty and so on earlier on. I think there's a genuine sort of recognition of the importance of that. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, is that I do worry a little bit. I mean, having lots of targets, like the 17 and so on, there's a good side to that, which is the explicit acknowledgement that there is this multidimensionality and that there are many, many things we care about. But there's also a danger that we become sort of obsessed about accounting and these different things and see them as silos, right? And just to bring in one issue on that is that there's huge interconnection between these different targets and these different things, right? And one thing that I wanted to mention explicitly, which I was thinking about when I heard Amber and Andrew present, is the issue of women's education and empowerment, right? Which I think we'd all agree is so fundamental in this context. I mean, the Sahel was mentioned earlier, right? And these are places where with fertility rates of 6 and 7 in some cases, right, in Niger, child per woman, it gets very hard to think about anything with those kinds of population growth rates and fertility rates. And, you know, we know that there are issues of access to family planning and so on, but the fundamental driver of fertility reductions in countries like that is women's education. Years of schooling amongst women in a number of those countries are some of the lowest in the world. I mean, they're really ridiculously low. I think I was in Mali earlier this year. I think the average schooling for women there is below 2, okay, years of schooling. And I mean, experience from other countries in Asia and Latin America suggests that women's education sort of goes through so many different ways. It increases labor force participation. It lowers fertility. It increases, it has intergenerational knock-on effects on girls and boys in the next generation. I think this is a huge issue for Africa. You know, I'm not much of a feminist myself, but as I work on Africa, I'm becoming one. I mean, it's just so hugely important in Africa. You know, the gaps are so large, and I think it's an important issue.
So building off of that a little bit, on the education piece, I'm going to try to wrap a few things together. One of the things that some of you commented on in this report shows is the importance of collecting data and having the knowledge and the numbers and knowing who's where and who's being reached and who isn't. But one of the flip sides of that I think we've seen in the education space is counting the number of people who are going to school has missed the quality indicators. And Andrew and Amber talked about that a little bit in the presentation, that there is a difference between actually physically being in school and actually learning. And in a previous life, I worked on the Hill and did a lot of work on this, where we used to count the number of textbooks we sent overseas or the number of teachers who were trained, and we weren't counting whether the teachers were showing up for work, whether they were teaching anything, whether those textbooks were being used. So I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on the challenges of quality, but also the challenges of measuring quality and kind of how we weave all of that into kind of what the next step might be on a report like this and what that means for policy going forward. I don't know who wants to take that first.
I mean, I can start. Just completely agree with your emphasis. I mean, it's something that, you know, I think the emphasis on years of schooling is driven by the availability of data on that, which even that is problematic, but is obviously much less problematic than measures of quality. In fact, there is some work done. I've done some work, and others have done work on measuring inequality of opportunity in education, in educational achievement using PISA data, which, you know, people may know in this audience is this data that the OECD collects. It's called the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, and it, you know, 15-year-olds take these tests, and they're comparable across countries and over time and space, and you measure how much they've learned in some way. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good measure of educational achievement. Like the PISA data, there are other kinds of data, but in Africa, one of the problems is that there's very little of that. I mean, as far as I know, there isn't a single African country yet in PISA, though I've just heard that there would be one joining. They have the SACMAC, so that's one thing that we can use more a little bit. So there is an issue of collecting more data on that. I think standardized tests are a very good way of collecting data on that. Not so much on the production function of how that education gets done. There's different ways of doing that. There's lots of work by the Poverty Action Lab and by the IPA in Yale, you know, where they even use cameras now in classrooms, and they code the way teachers spend time doing things, and they say, you know, this teacher spent too much time just kind of getting the classroom organized. This other one was actually teaching, you know. That's after they show up, which is a first big problem. At the World Bank, I'll just mention this and conclude on this point. We have this initiative called the Service Delivery Indicators, right? The SDI, Service Delivery Indicators, in Africa, which surveys schools and health centers to obtain information on things like absenteeism, but also going a little bit beyond that in terms of what they do, what methods they actually use. In the case of clinics, you know, in addition to the nurse, were there medicines there? You know, these sorts of things. The picture that emerges from that, and it's a pity we don't have any here today, but I've used some in presentations before. The picture that emerges is very dire, you know, very, very dire indeed. I mean, people are now going to school, and that's important. Access is important, but surprisingly little learning actually taking place in a number of these schools, as you were suggesting. So just to agree that we need more data on that, and we need, it's natural in some sense that access is the first step, but we need very quickly to follow that up with quality, otherwise it won't mean very much.
I could keep asking questions, but why don't we open it to the audience and give you all an opportunity to participate. We've got some microphones that'll be coming up to you when it's your turn. Please say who you are, and we will take probably 3 questions at once, and then I'll turn to the panel to answer, and then we'll go back. So I saw a very quick hand up here in front.
Thank you for a great presentation and interesting report. I actually just want to say, though, I was shocked that Mr. Ferreira or Dr. Ferreira would say, I'm not a feminist. That just means someone who believes in equality for women. So I hope you were joking, but it was just a shocking thing to hear at an event about equality. Thanks.
All right, go right in the back.
My name is Mahmoud Ayoub with Centennial Group, formerly with the World Bank. Just a quick question to the authors. In one of the graphs, there was a comparison of access and HOI. And it appears that in many countries, like Niger, for example, the gap between the two is so small and access is so little that would it make sense to focus more on access rather than the question of equity at the beginning?
Let's go, Ben, right to your, right there.
Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm a president of an organization called Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflicts and violence, and we are in the rural area. We focus on the rural area, water, infrastructure, which is water and sanitation, renewable energy, electricity, into the rural areas, looking at education. Thank you so much for your presentation. Looking at the rural areas where we need more help, more infrastructure, electricity, water, and sanitation, how do you collaborate, or how can you collaborate with the rural area communities, especially organizations like us, for the rural area to get what you are talking here? Here we are in the report, reading the report, but when you go on the ground, the actual ground, you don't get anything on the ground, especially people like us who are working in the rural areas. How do we work together as community, as organization, and the rural area people, what they are going through? So how do we make this happen, other than just reading the report and that's the end of the report? The people there have another story of education, infrastructure. And the other thing is, how do you include people with disability, children with disability, access to education, the deaf, the lame, the blind? How have you included it in the report, and if so, how can you support? Thank you.
Okay, we'll do one more right here in the front, and then we'll get some answers.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Kevin Wednesday. I'm a retired Navy captain. I'm on the board of Finn Church Aid. And one question is, how, as you're working in these huge problems, looking at the demographic changes of Africa, forecasting out to the end of the century, what, about a billion people now roughly? Going to be about 4 billion by the end of the century. You're kind of playing catch up already. How does that factor in?
Great, thanks. So a few issues to deal with here. The first, I'll turn it over to Andrew Nambar to address the first question about access first, and then I think I'd like to also ask the panel about to build off of that. There's a conventional wisdom that you need to getting out there to the hardest to reach is an impediment to growth, and what you need to do is get access and then kind of go out to them later. And I think these reports are showing the opposite, and so it'd be interesting to delve into that a little bit more to build off that first question. And let's start there, and then we'll.
Thank you for the question. The short answer is yes. We should be focusing on access. So one thing to remember is that while we talk a lot about equality of opportunity, what I started the presentation with is by saying that the indicator we're using is a combination of coverage, access, with a penalty for inequality. So these are what we call 0-1 indicators. You either have it or you don't. That's the way they're defined, which means that access is paramount. Unless, if you don't have it, of course, if nobody has it, then there is perfect equality, but that's not the equality of opportunity we want. And the indicator actually includes that, but the point is very well taken. So which is why, our messages are, you will see, are not even in the last slide. The messages were actually about access to opportunity with equality, but access comes first.
All right, so coming back up here, we have the question of kind of access versus equality and focusing on the hardest to reach. Collaboration with local organizations and really reaching out to the folks in the rural areas and reaching children with disabilities as well. And then the question about demographic changes, youth bulges, population growth.
Can I take a stab at a couple of them? And I mean, let me start by saying, I mean, I worked in places like South Sudan and Ethiopia as my two most recent assignments. And in places where you've got such a low base of access to service to begin with, I think the question of increasing access automatically has an equity impact. I mean, in a place like Ethiopia, the top quintile has different access services, but the next four are essentially the same. So it's not the usual kind of stepping stone. It's basically one step, and it's 4 steps roughly at the same level. There's issues with pastoralists and access to services in pastoralist areas of some of those countries specifically. But putting that aside, that's roughly the change in the kind of the inequity. So anything you do, even for the next rung down in the 20 percentile, you're having an equity impact. But that's there for those types of environments. And in many other environments, it is the more stepping stone kind of where, if you really focus on the most poor and the most rural and the furthest, you're going to have the biggest equity change. So I think it does really depend on context, is I would say. I'd like to kind of touch upon a couple of other issues. I think, again, I want to go back to this idea of working in rural areas with local communities and local organization as being the most important, in a government-led process, as being the most important way forward in terms of equitable access to services. And specifically to focus on the issue, and I think a couple of people have raised it, of fragile contexts, where, in fragile contexts in particular, where central government might either be unwilling or unable to basically address these issues. The more we can have systems that are decentralized, that build local capacity, that build resilience at local level, that rely on civil society organization and local community engagement, including feedback loops, what I call democracy with a small d, the more successful you're going to be in terms of creating systems that can resist shocks, that can increase access to services in a way that reduces vulnerability and increases opportunity. So I think I think that's all of our intent. And everyone sitting on this panel wants very much to be working in those areas and has strategies specifically designed to support work in those areas. The last point I would make is on demographics. I think one of the things that we're going to be challenged with increasingly is working in urban areas, actually. And I think a lot more of sub-Saharan Africa, but a lot more of the needs that we're going to have to focus on is going to be in urban areas. And a lot of our models and our thinking and the way we work, including by government in many of these countries, is really focused on rural areas, understandably. But I think there's going to be a new urban reality. And urban may not be Nairobi. Urban may be a town with 20 to 25,000 people that needs electricity, that needs access to basic services in a different way from a village. And I think we need to be working on that level of urbanism. But also just to say it's not Malthusian. I think as progress occurs, people make different choices in terms of how many children they have, which are perfectly rational. And so we're going to be in a situation where there's going to be more opportunities than risks in the future.
So maybe if I build on a couple of points Ted made, I think there is this notion that somehow you don't go after the hardest to reach because that'll slow down overall reductions. I'm talking about reducing child mortality. And in fact, I think what our report found is that about 1/5 of the countries that were achieving above median rates of reduction in child mortality, they were also sort of on an equitable path so that no groups were being left behind, so to speak. So for 1/5 of the fastest reducing child survival mortality countries reducing, they were on an equitable path. If you look at the countries, and there's probably about maybe 15 of them, 10, 15, something like that, that were reducing the sort of inequity between the groups. A majority of the ones that were having equitable reductions in child survival were also higher than median rate of reducing child mortality. So there's something, you know, it's not necessarily the case, but it's connected in a way that going after the harder to reach is not necessarily going to slow you down, and there's good evidence to say it'll speed you up. So I think there's a lot of rationale for that kind of focus. On the point about rural and urban, I think, you know, to Ted's point, a lot of what all of us are trying to do is extend health systems out to people that are, you know, that are not connected with them yet. And quite a bit of that over the last 10 years or so really has involved community health workers, and most of that is out in rural areas. So a lot of the work that we as Save the Children have done is really working with communities, working with local partners to kind of extend a certain amount of essential services out as far as it can go. And I think when you look at some of the poster child countries that have had above median, you know, for example, Malawi's met MDG 4, but it's done it in an equitable fashion. How did they do that? Well, they had equity as an explicit target for what they were doing, but it was all about getting community health workers out to these areas and working with local partners. It wasn't about, you know, bringing everybody to hospitals and things like that. So it really, you can have a pro-poor equitable strategy, achieve the reductions, but it's about pushing these services out. Plus, you have to have resources. I mean, Malawi is one of a handful of countries in Africa. There's an Abuja Declaration that talks about a certain level of investment in health, and Malawi also, besides, it did meet this sort of investment, more than met this investment in health, but did it in an equitable way where they tried to push it out to rural communities. I think, you know, the group that, I mean, disabled is a very good point. And I think that requires, and I think this Sustainable Development Goal opportunity provides a way to put a spotlight on those groups as well. I mean, it's an area that hasn't gotten enough attention. I was in China not too long ago, and we do a lot of work with on inclusive education in China. So I think I would agree with you. More attention needs to be given to that.
Shall I do a few points?
If you'd like, yes.
Yeah. So let me actually start with the feminist one where I misspoke. I think what I was trying to say was that even if you started out without a particular concern for the equity of distribution between men and women, looking at the problems in Africa make you just realize how important women's education and empowerment are, even without any other consideration. So that's what I wanted to say about that. On access and the HOI, I do want to say one thing about that, and that is that it does matter how you measure things a little bit. And as Andrew and Amber pointed out, this kind of measure of inequality of opportunity is very much a basic beginning, which is access to certain services, right? So when you measure inequality of opportunity in other ways, even if you just go to quality, even if you just go to the measurement of inequality of opportunity in achievement of learning, or if you do it using income, then the correlation between averages and access on the one hand and equality of opportunity on the other becomes much, much weaker. And I'd like to emphasize that point, which I was making on Saturday at a similar roundtable to this at the Kennedy School in Cambridge, which is the following: that in fact, equal access is not at all sufficient for equal opportunities. The way John Romer, which someone, I think Amber put up in the beginning here, thinks of equal opportunities, and many other people think of equal opportunities, is that outcomes should be determined primarily by differences in effort or individual responsibility, and that individual circumstances shouldn't matter. Notice that circumstances should not matter for outcomes. Now that's saying that parental education, parental background, family background shouldn't matter for outcomes. Now, we all know how enormously important family background is for outcomes, which suggests that if you want to have policy for equal opportunities, it's not that the school should be the same. We should put more resources in the school for people with worse family backgrounds. We should be spending a lot more effort and attention. We should have the best teachers for them, not the other way around, right? So most people, and you spent probably too much time working on measuring inequality of opportunity, but most of us who work on that area would see the HOI as a sort of fairly basic requirement where, basic access to things. And so it may give you the impression, and as the index rightly does, I forget who asked it, I think you, sir, asked the question, right? Indeed, by these metrics, access is fundamental, but once you start thinking being a little bit more demanding about what equity and equality of opportunity mean, then the degree of effort you have to spend on people you're not reaching becomes stronger. So I wanted to make that point. The very brief point on rural areas, the point that was made about rural, again, this is a huge thing in Africa. It's impossible to overstate it, right? 60% of the population or more in Africa, on average, sub-Saharan Africa, live in rural areas. In contrast to, for example, 20% in Latin America, mostly, okay? 80% of the poor at our standard $1.25 a day, very strict poverty measure, 80% of the poor work in agriculture and therefore live in rural areas. The gaps in access to services are tremendous. There are too many statistics, I just remember some, but I was in Zambia not long ago. Rural electrification rates in Zambia are 3%. And Zambia is not one of the poorest countries. 3% only. It's not 100% in urban areas, but it's a lot higher than 3%. So equality of opportunity or poverty reduction or any of these things in Africa has to go through the rural areas and, in fact, increase productivity in agriculture, which is a huge, huge area. There's off-farm employment, there's growth in services and so on, but I think you cannot overstate the importance of agriculture in that area. On demographics, I had a few things as well, but let me not be long. Just to say that I share your concern very much with the population growth rates. I think they will adjust, as was being suggested, but in some places they are adjusting very slowly. And the Sahel is another point. I mean, there's a big difference between Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but Southern Africa, where fertility rates are falling, and the Sahel, where they're not. And so there are some big issues there. And if you start thinking about the proportions of young people who will enter the labor market, the demands on jobs, are very, very substantial. So I think it's something we're all thinking about and struggling with.
Okay. Thanks. More questions or comments? Right up here.
My name is Sad Atakujo. I work for U.S. Department of Labor, Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. My question, though, is not on forced labor or child labor, but it's on what Francesco said with regards to national ownership. What we have is that African countries, are consulted, let me put it that way, for lack of a better term, in terms of all these development goals. So my question is that how do you get these African countries and governments to buy into the new SDG and the development goals?
Anyone else?
My name is Alan Frisch. I'm a professor of economics. I've lived in Africa for many years. Two things that seem, if these things are going to be achieved, the financial aspect of this, which nobody's really talked about, where the funds come to try to make the infrastructure that's necessary for this all to come about, and to build on what the previous speaker just said, where is the political will to do this in Africa? And if there's no political will, it doesn't matter whether the resources are there or if anybody wants to do this, but it will never happen. So nobody's really addressed that. So I'm curious what you folks think about that.
Well, why don't we just take those two questions together and address political will and financing, which are two sides of a similar coin at least, and political stability as well. I mean, I think we've dealt a little bit with fragile states, but I think one of the things that we saw in the Ebola crisis, which impacts us as well, is kind of an inability of the government to really get in and be believed and be trusted and serve the role that it needed to serve to really make an impact against the outbreak quickly enough. So how do we get all of those pieces that are not specific to the health system or to the education system in place to make this work?
Let me take a little stab at the political will issue. And I would contrast it with the MDGs, which when you go around a lot of countries in Africa, they really are owned. And they're important, and they're used to shape national policy. That wasn't the case when they were first adopted. And a lot of the MDGs, it wasn't quite, they were put together in a back room somewhere in New York City, but pretty close. And yet they eventually, people bought into it and saw how they could be really useful in driving progress, focusing resources, mobilizing resources. The SDGs are really different, are coming out in a very different way. It's a much more open process of consultation. There's been there's just been a ton of consultation across the world and everywhere, different groups, online. So it's been a very much more open process. The African Union has come up with its own position on what it wants in the way of sustainable development goals. So there's been a much greater dialogue. And partly, I think, if you look at sort of why do we have 169 targets, that's the trade-off. When you get everybody into the room and start talking about what's important to people, you end up with more than just 3 or 4 things. So, as we discussed earlier, the benefit of where we are so far with the Sustainable Development Goals is that there is a much more greater engagement by lots of different stakeholders. I mean, development nowadays is not just about donors and national governments. It's a very changed landscape. So across that landscape, you have many more people that are involved in the conversation of what should the next generation of these goals be. But particularly, I feel reasonably confident that when you talk to African governments, they know what's going on, they're involved in it. Now the challenge is this: a lot of this conversation is taking place in New York, and a lot of it is taking place in foreign ministries, and perhaps other parts of the national government, when you're talking particularly finance ministries, and some of the line ministries who are going to then be responsible for implementing these goals, they're a little further behind. So what really, to your point about how do you get the ownership, I think part of what has to happen is that you have to have these conversations in New York that are taking place be also you have to have sort of implementation conversations back in capital. So health ministries and education ministries and at the provincial and local level, you have a sense of trying these on for size, seeing what's important, and then to the point of where the resources are going to come from. I mean, that needs to be, that's partly what Addis is about, because I think there's a sense that quite a bit of this could be mobilized in domestic resources, not all of it. But I do think that the SDGs are kind of being given birth in a very different way than the MDGs are, and there's a lot more ownership, and it's not the top-down process that the MDGs to some extent that was a little bit of the flavor of it when they first got launched.
I mean, just to add that Kenya has been one of the co-chairs of the Open Working Group and has been instrumental in steering the SDGs, and now Namibia is very heavily involved. So there's been very heavy African involvement in the SDGs. It's been a much more open process, and so from that perspective, I think we're off to a good start. I think some of the complexities that are arising, and they are around financing, are not so much related to the SDGs, because the emphasis is going to be very heavily on domestic resources. ODA is not as important as it was 20 years ago as a driver of change. There's foreign direct investment. There's many other sources of financing that are going to be critical. I think where the issue is really difficult, and it both combines both questions, is on the issue of climate change adaptation. Mm-hmm. And I think Sendai almost was not concluded, did not reach a conclusion on the issue of financing and the response. Does everyone have an equal responsibility? Do some countries that went through a development phase that was expensive 50 or 100 years ago and are now wanting new countries coming up not to go through that same expensive phase of development? Is there a responsibility to pay for a more carbon neutral, more sustainable, form of development? I think those are the questions that started in Sendai, almost led to Sendai not being concluded. In some ways, Sendai kicked the can down the road. And I think for COP21 in Paris, the meeting on climate change in Paris in December, that's going to be critical. And I think that's where the issue of financing is going to come up. I think for the SDGs, there is a strong realization that this needs to be financed and costed, and there'll be innovative ways of doing that. On the sustainability aspect and the climate change aspect, that's where the most difficult conversation will take place.
Let me just briefly take a couple of points on this. On the political will, I mean, I agree with what was said about how there's more engagement by African countries with the SDGs than there were perhaps with the MDGs and so on. But I think it's also, not to sort of have too rosy a picture. We have to acknowledge that there are huge governance issues that remain, and there are governments and politicians, individual in other governments in Africa, as there are in other places, that are not particularly concerned with reaching the poorest people necessarily, and that have other individual objectives, right? So that remains the case. It's probably true in all regions. It's certainly true in Africa. And I think, you know, I don't know what the short-term solution to that is. The long-term solution, I'm almost certain, passes through, you have to have two things, I always believe: the formal institutions of democracy and more educated people. Africa already has, in most places, not all, the formal institutions of democracy. As people get more and more educated, I think those popular pressures will come up. But we again see that in the process of this new social contract that I've been describing in Latin America. And it's by no means as though Latin America is kind of super successful in that either, but it's where I'm from, and I've seen that movement. And I think we're moving in that direction in many places in Africa too. On the financing issue, just to say that, I mean, obviously there will be a room for external financing, but there's a lot of room for domestic financing if African governments decide to tax effectively and better than they do at the moment, and then to spend that money well, which is, of course, it's good, just goes back to the political will question, straight back. So I think, you know, with the natural resources, even with lower commodity prices, with the natural resources many of these countries have, tax rates are very low, there is lots of room for domestic financing once the incentives are there. And then once you've got that money, you've got to spend it well, which is another huge issue. But I think those are again issues of governance and politics to a large extent.
First one right here.
Hi, my name is Dr. Noemi Voglozin. I'm an intern with a nonprofit that is called OIC International. I think I'm going to take a little bit, like 2 or 3 minutes, because I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. First of all, the first question I'm going to ask is, the title of a seminar is, Do African Children Have an Equal Chance? Do African children have an equal chance compared to whom? That's the first question I'm going to ask. So a little bit about myself. I'm from Benin, West Africa. I'm not poor. My parents, I'm not poor. In American terms, we are going to say that right now they are middle class. But when I was younger, my parents were really struggling. And for example, when I was in primary school, we didn't have electricity at home, but we weren't living in a rural area. We were living in a city. And we were living in Ivory Coast, and I took a national exam just studying with a light coming from a lamp post that was in front of our house, because we didn't have electricity in our house. But I wasn't living in a village. Another thing is, when I was going to university, I didn't have water at where I was living, but I was living near the university, and the university is in the city. It's not in a rural area. Another thing is that I'm lucky enough to be here with you. I'm standing here with you today. And I was lucky enough to go through my studies with fellowship and assistantship. Right now, I have an engineer degree in agriculture. I have a master's degree in agriculture, and I came to the US with an assistantship, a graduate research assistantship, and I went through my doctoral degrees with teaching assistantship, and I got my PhD in geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And right now, it has been a year, and I've been looking for a position, and I haven't been able to find a job. And it's not because I'm not smart. Each and every time I'm telling people my background, they are, wow, I'm impressed, I'm impressed. But they don't know what to do with me. They just don't know what to do with me. Because once they are going to tell you, oh, you are not an American, I cannot bother to sponsor you. And when I apply, they are going to tell me, oh, you are overqualified. And put all of that put aside, they are going to tell me, you don't have any experience. And that's the thing. We don't have the same educational system as you do in developed countries. And granted that we have everything, you give us everything in developing countries. We have the resources, we have the education, we have the water, we have the money, we have everything. Do we really have an equal chance compared to young professional, young adults from developing country? Can we really play on a level field? From my perspective, I'm just going to tell you that African children can have an equal chance, but that we're going to have an equal chance if, one, they have rich parents who are going to send them in developed countries when they are younger, and these children are going to spend all their studies in developed countries, and they are going to gain the experience, and they will be able to play on a level field with children from developed countries, or there will be children who will be born from there will be second-generation children. For example, there will be my children. There will be children who will be second-generation children, because that's just the way it is. I mean, from my perspective, because I'm living it.
Thank you for that. You've raised a lot of important points. I think we had two more hands over here, and then we'll come back and wrap up. Either order.
Hi, thank you. My name is Paul Johnson. I had a question for the panel. Wanted to hear your perspectives, if you had anything to add with respect to the private sector and with respect to multinationals expanding their operations in the healthcare space into Africa, and how some are integrating with the local ministries to advance and move the needle on some of these human development issues. I just sort of want to get a general sense of if you think it's effective, or if you think things can be done better, or if you see some multinationals from some countries do things in a different fashion. Just curious to hear your thoughts.
All right, and then to the woman in red here.
Hi, I'm Nida Malik. I'm a graduate student here, but representing WASH advocates today. So my question is that earlier it was mentioned that certain gaps, such as enrollment rates and certain health services, have narrowed, but others, such as access to safe water and sanitation, have not. So what can be done to promote integration among these sectors and these issues? So we discussed barriers to education and keeping the kids in school. So for example, girls, when they hit puberty, are dropping out of school because they don't have a safe and comfortable place to use the restroom any time of the year, but particularly, after age puberty. So there you go. Thank you.
Great. So a number of issues raised there. We have this question that I was actually hoping to ask as well, of integration. So across these various issues, water, sanitation, infrastructure, education, health, how do we make sure that we're hitting on all of those? The role of the private sector is a very important one that we haven't discussed yet. And then this question of, of having an equal chance kind of within the country, within the continent, within the broader, the broader international system, and kind of what are we building towards, and where can we, how can that trajectory be improved?
I can try very quickly on equal chance compared to whom, the first question that was asked. So there's, this is another thing that came up at the Kennedy School on Saturday, is this issue of national and international equality and inequality, right? So I think most of the study was actually looking at equality of opportunity within each of these countries. But of course, in the work of the World Bank on equality of opportunity started around 2004, 2005 with a report that actually Anna and I were both involved in, which was the World Development Report on Equity and Development, which is when we started looking at these questions of equal opportunity quite seriously. In the institution, of course, in academia, that precedes it by a lot, but we started looking at it at that time. And in the motivation, in the beginning of that report, we actually had two stories of pairs of children. And one of them was two children that grew up in the same country. But the other one was comparing a Swedish boy, a rich Swedish boy, to a poor, I think it was South African, or I'm not sure, or an African girl that was much poorer, okay? And the gap in the playing field internationally is just gigantic. I mean, it's already large enough here, but it's orders of magnitude larger internationally, right? So much so, and I'm going to be nerdy for 2 seconds to point out that John Rawls, who is a political philosopher who many of you may know and who wrote A Theory of Justice, which is taken to be one of the fundamental works arguing for equality within countries, in another book called Law of the Peoples, actually argues that because there's no real social contract, and that's interesting for those of us in the international organizations, he argues because there's very little social contract in the international context, there's no world government, he argues there is no requirement of justice to promote equal opportunities from the bottom. Okay? Now, there are people who disagree with him, myself included, but that's the view, even from one of the parents of egalitarianism. So just to say that whatever you are struggling with, many people are struggling with, it's a huge issue. The international disparities are enormous. My former colleague, Branko Milanovic, decomposes inequality in the world into bits due to class, which he calls, which is actually any gaps within countries, and then location, which is inequality between countries. And that second part is about 80% of the overall. So just to put that in perspective, I have no answers to that. Although I will say, sorry, I will say very quickly on that I do believe now, and I've said this in a number of African countries, and whenever I say it, I say, look, let me take off my World Bank hat and put on my Brazilian citizen's hat for a moment and tell you that, the World Bank and UNICEF and all of these things, they can help. Okay, but fundamentally, just ask the Chinese, fundamentally, we will develop by our own shoestrings and bootstrings. We've got to pull ourselves up that way. That's how everybody else did it. Of course, we have to try and make the international order fairer, but it's up to us to a very large extent. And one sign of maturity and development is when we, as developing countries, stop blaming, everybody else for what's going on. Often it's our own elites that we have to look at rather than anything else. But I'll stop there.
Just a couple of quick ones. Firstly, on the issue of integration, I think the SDGs, because there's so many indicators, are going to hopefully force us to think of platforms that can bring several of the goals and some of the indicators together. I think we need to look at health as a platform, as education as a platform, which is achieving multi-sectoral outcomes. And I remember when I was the representative of UNICEF in Ethiopia, meeting with the minister, who said to me, the problem is you, not us. I mean, on Monday, I've got your health people talking about health. On Tuesday, I've got your nutrition people talking about nutrition. On Wednesday, I've got your water, sanitation, hygiene people talking about sanitation, hygiene, and they all want the same community health worker to be at a training, a separate training, for 2 weeks each, on their own specific bespoke project, because that's how the funding's organized, that's how the accountability of your system is organized. Well, this is our country. You know, this is and we want to integrate it. So you all get together, all of you foreign partners, sit down with our ministry and let's have one training, one consolidated approach, and it's going to be a trade-off. We're going to have less time on stunting because we're going to have to make room for sanitation. And in a 2-week training, we're not going to have enough time for everything. We're going to have to decide what's more important, how much time is devoted to that. That's just an example of the kind of work that we're going to need to do, because at the end of the day, the same progress is going to be made on sanitation, that's going to be made on stunting, that's going to be made on access to basic health services. I think education is another such platform where school, as there's basically 3 points of contact with the family when it comes to services. There's health, there's water, there's education, and increasingly there's a social welfare point of contact, which is, I think, an opportunity which is emerging increasingly in different points in Africa. And then, your intervention was, I thought, very thought-provoking, and I think your answer was equally thought-provoking. Can I just say that the bulk of my time in Africa, and I've lived in Africa for 20 years, has been in Kenya. My wife is Kenyan. And you said you came from a middle-class family. She would probably have come from what would be considered a lower middle-class family. If I see the opportunity that the next generation in her family is having, vis-a-vis the generation of her parents, it's just incredible. I mean, that's one country in a big continent, but it's a country where there's an emerging middle class, where the economy has made enormous progress, where there's still huge disparities, but overall, it's a place where it's just not the same place as 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And I think there's increasingly, that is Africa, not so much, Central African Republic or places where those opportunities don't exist. And I think that's another message in the book. And I think it's a message I know we all know, but I think that's going to be a big part of the opportunity that exists.
Just maybe pick up on the private sector point a little bit. So, I mean, it's clear from the conversation earlier that the private sector is a real driver for a lot of change that we're seeing taking place, and the financial flows, innovation. There's just a lot of potential there in the private sector, and I think it's if we talked earlier about the Sustainable Development Goals, the private sector is more in view with those than was certainly the case with the MDG. So, for example, the Secretary General's high-level panel, he had representatives from the private sector on it. I think more work needs to be done on that, but it's, as we in the civil society community have been thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, we have been sort of having conversations with corporations and others to sort of see how we can each get involved in taking this agenda forward. It's not yet clear, but I think it is. I think that we have to factor that in the way the changes the targets that have been set are going to drive progress. The private sector is going to be part of that. When you look at the national level, I mean, a lot of the experiences that, speaking for Save the Children, that we've had are really in public-private partnerships. And there's, particularly in the health sector, I can think of a number of them where you really have, for that sort of, Save the Children is able to kind of reach into communities and connect with communities. Private sector has things that they're bringing to the table. And we have one, Helping Babies Breathe, which is really saving newborn children, and it's a public-private partnership in that respect. So that's one model. It's not the only model. I mean, I think increasingly people are talking about shared value and other ways where it can be private. You can make a profit, but also bring about social change or social impact investing. So I think there's a lot of different ways, both for the private sector to sort of think about its involvement in taking, in a positive way, in taking forward the Sustainable Development Goals. What is their particular role? And some of the roundtables that we've had with business representatives to say, we really think we have to sort of take that back into our business and think about how do we get involved in this. It is at that level. And then secondly, sort of for companies to look at, a lot of times it's a win-win. Then of course there's the whole sort of, partly it's about what are the incentives that enable the private sector to play a role in advancing this agenda. And then there's sort of the whole regulatory side of things as well. So I think there's enormous potential there.
Well, we're just about out of time. I want to close by giving you each an opportunity to say kind of a last few words and also pose this question. If I call you all up in 15 years and invite you back to have this conversation again, what are we going to be talking about? What's on the horizon when we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals 2.0? You can ignore that question if you want to, but some closing comments, and let's throw that out there.
Well, let me just maybe a point that I think was made in the report, but I just would underscore, which is, and particularly you'd expect that from an organization like Save the Children, start early. I mean, particularly if you look at malnutrition being a very, it's almost a majority of child deaths are connected to malnutrition, and that really begins, with when a mother is pregnant. There's the first 1,000 days. It makes a huge difference, and if you don't tackle it then, it has sort of lifelong consequences. That's on the nutrition side of things. I think we certainly see with early childhood development and brain, and brain development, the need for, getting earlier on in the process, early childhood development programs that governments can push out there, because then the children, and we have some, for example, that one that we're working with the World Bank and the government of Mozambique on, where we show really powerful results, like 87%, I think it is, sort of cognitive improvement for kids that are going through these set of interventions. So you want to start that earlier, and that's part of the way you achieve these targets. It's part of the way you end these gaps. So I would say to that. And then the second point we talked about a little bit is how do you measure? I think that's it's a good problem to have. I don't think we've done it yet. There is in terms of measuring learning as opposed to just counting kids in school or counting teachers in the classroom. There is something called IDEALA, the International Development Education Learning Assessment, something like that. So there are some tools out there, perhaps still in early stages, but I think it really is. It's as we go from averages to these in some way absolute goals, I think we need to, our methodologies need to catch up so we can kind of track and note progress and then of course correct as necessary. So.
Just a couple of final thoughts. One is that, and that perhaps we haven't discussed sufficiently, but firstly, a big part of our focus in terms of sustainability also needs to be on fragile context and unstable environment. I mean, as things currently stand, no country which is fragile is actually going to achieve the MDGs. And that needs to be a big part of what we focus on. And, we speak about building resilience, about bringing humanitarian development together. I think it's particularly important to do so in places which are fragile. And that's places often where we tend to operate vertically, where we tend not to try to build systems, where we try not to look at sustainability, and those are the places that need it most. And I think a place like DR Congo, which is actually making significant progress recently, is evidence that you don't need to have a government which is a source of all solutions. Bangladesh is another place where civil society, I think a coalition of organizations and bodies under a normative framework led by the state has been able to make huge difference. So there's different ways to achieve, I think, the finish line. I think that's a big part of what we need to be looking at going ahead. But secondly, to say that I think there's, and specifically for sub-Saharan Africa, there are huge opportunities for children. And I think we really need to be optimistic about what this next 15 years is going to be able to provide for children. And I think look ahead. We've said there's been all this gains in access to basic education. We now need to look at quality of learning and secondary education. You then also don't want to be in a situation as you ended up in the Middle East, where you had a large number of youth who were educated but didn't have economic opportunities. I mean, it all needs to kind of to fit together. But overall, I think a picture where we will see progress, and where we need, I think, specifically to focus on those places which are more fragile, which require that additional assistance.
So 2 quick parting thoughts on what we might talk about 15 years from now. One thing that I think we will be talking about looking retrospectively that we talked a little about today is migration, international migration in particular. So of course, a huge amount of it is already there. But if you look at the demographic trends that someone suggested earlier, in Africa and Europe, and the income differentials there, I think, you know, it's a time bomb, and we'll be looking at that with increasing concern. The other thing I think we'll be talking about is we'll be talking about the previous 15 years, which are the next 15 years now, from either one of two perspectives. And I think you can all guess which one of them I hope will come true, but let me put both of them. If you look at Branko Milanovic, as I was saying earlier, at his international inequality, in the last 15 years or so, there's some convergence between countries. And that's driven primarily by China and India growing very fast, some other East Asian countries. But Africa's been part of that in the Africa Rising period, basically the last 10 to 12 years, not before. Before it was widely diverging. So the big question is, can we share this optimistic picture that I think all of us here on this panel have with lower commodity prices and some of the challenges that are coming ahead? There is a coincidence, whether it's a coincidence or not, between high commodity prices and a highly benign external environment over the last 10, 12 years and Africa's rise. Africa now needs to be able to sustain that in what will likely be a more challenging period. And I think in 15 years, we will look back and either have seen Africa join with China and India as part of this convergence, or if things go wrong, lag further behind in ways that it did in the 70s and 80s. And I think it's by no means guaranteed. It's really up to all of us in the process to ensure that the more favorable outcome prevails.
Well, and that is a very good note to end on. So I want to thank my panelists, Michael, Ted, and Francisco, also our presenters earlier, Andrew and Ambar and Anna. Thank you all for coming. A big thanks to Ben Hubner from the Africa program for pulling this together. And we are done. Thanks very much.
If all students in low-income countries left school with basic reading skills, it could lead to an estimated 171 million people being lifted out of poverty. Okay, now how do we measure all this? To start with, we track coverage rates and coverage gaps for access to basic services among children. We've also used this data to develop the Human Opportunity Index. For each country, the index measures the availability of key basic services and how fairly they are distributed among the population. So if a country's services aren't equally accessible for different groups of its population, they'd score lower on the index than a country with services available to all. In other words, the Human Opportunity Index is coverage corrected for inequality. You can find out more about inequality of opportunity by exploring our Visualize Inequality dashboard.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for being here, and to CSIS for hosting us. And before I start the presentation, I just want to start by thanking the very large team. And Andrew and I are here representing actually a very large group of people, including people who worked on the data from our central unit, from the regions, and so on. The data that we use is exclusively from the Demographic and Health Surveys. So that's, again, it's a great source of data for looking at poverty, inequality, and access to services. So I'm not going to spend much time on this slide because I think that's what the video was about and what Anna was also talking about. And essentially, we are concerned about inequality of opportunity, which, as you have heard, it's about inequality which is attributable to the circumstances at birth. So that's basically what it is. Now, there are various interpretations of how this type of inequality can be measured. So we have indices, for example, and we have actually one of the authors who has produced some of these indices sitting here, where you can actually estimate inequality of opportunity from incomes itself. So in other words, you take overall distribution of income and you see which part of that inequality is actually attributable to differences between groups. So that's one way of measuring inequality of opportunity. The kind of measure that we are talking about are essentially looking at children and looking at their access to opportunities. We're not trying to be exhaustive. In other words, we do not claim that having access to this minimal bundle of opportunities, which is essentially school attendance, immunization, relatively clean water, improved source of sanitation, not being stunted, that these actually ensure a level playing field for everyone necessarily. But this is where one starts. This is the basic minimum that everyone should have. And in addition to that, you need much more. But even if we start at that level, what we are going to show you that while progress has been made, there are enormous challenges that you see in the 20 African countries that we have studied. Oops. So the Human Opportunity Index is, as the video was trying to show that through a very sort of a quick exposition, but let me just explain it a little bit. So what it is essentially, it is not just about inequality of opportunity. It's coverage corrected for inequality of opportunity. In other words, if you had 100% coverage of a particular service, let's say safe water, the Human Opportunity Index is going to be 100%, right? Or 1 or 100%. If coverage, on the other hand, was, let's say, 50%, and that's where the Human Opportunity Index actually adds value to your normal coverage rate. Because what it's going to do is that it's going to take the 50% coverage rate, and then it's going to measure, then it's going to penalize that 50%.
Fairness is also a question of, I would say, laying the foundations of growth and of smart economics as well. Now, we have used these measures of equality of opportunity in our policy dialogues a lot. We started this dialogue in Latin America, where they have contributed to building a strong focus on equity. We have examples from different countries. I was going to mention one in Argentina, in the province of Chaco, where essentially the municipalities are working to improve public service delivery, and into their monitoring and evaluation tools, they have incorporated these particular measures of equity of service delivery. I think in Latin America, what we found is that approaching the issue of inequality from its very core, from its roots in terms of equality of opportunity, opens the door to a policy dialogue that may otherwise not always be open. People can get very ideological about redistribution, but it's very hard to be ideological when you're talking about access to basic services for children, and you're talking about giving every child the same chance, a fair chance. So this is something we do increasingly in other countries, some in Africa, Zambia, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire. We've done this regional report. We are doing this in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, also South Africa. And we have we compile this data on inequality of opportunity for every region in a very interactive visualized inequality dashboard that's available through our external website. So if you ever just want to check in and look at a dimension of inequality and see how different countries and regions are doing, it's something that's very accessible and very user-friendly and very striking in the results. I mean, we see progress in a number of areas, particularly, I think, health and education, but really, really slow progress in areas such as access to clean water and sanitation. So progress is uneven, and it prompts a question of why that is and what can be done about it. So before I give the floor to Ambar and Andrew, who are the authors of the report and are going to share with us some of their main findings, we do want to show you a very short video that I think illustrates the concept. The concept is a little bit complicated to measure, but actually quite intuitive at its origin. So let's watch the video, and then we will move on to our two presenters. Thank you very much once again for being here today.
Inequality is a major concern around the globe. A recent report by Oxfam calculated that almost half of the world's wealth is held by just 1% of the world's population. Nonetheless, you can argue that some inequality between people is not necessarily a bad thing. In particular, you can think about inequality of outcomes, things like the amount of money a person makes or the kind of job they have, as rewarding effort and superior life choices. But what about when a person's potential to achieve these outcomes is simply determined by the lottery of birth? We call this inequality of opportunity. Characteristics like gender, economic circumstances, geography, and ethnicity can trap large groups of people in poverty and specifically affect access to basic services among children. For instance, only 5% of children in the poorest 40% of households in Madagascar have finished primary school. So what will it take to offer equal opportunities to children born into different circumstances across the world? Bringing a basic set of goods and services to disadvantaged people has a huge impact. Clean water, education, electricity, and sanitation make a tremendous difference in early childhood. As these children grow into working-age adults, their skills, knowledge, and health become essential to getting jobs, accelerating economic mobility, and reducing inequality in the long run. For example, according to the Global Partnership for Education,
just think about how do we make progress on this agenda. Now, I think many of you have probably heard about the World Bank's new institutional goals, ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity, by which we mean really promoting the incomes of the bottom 40% of the distribution in every country. Able to help countries build societies with more economic and social mobility, and societies where the productive potential of every person is harnessed, independent of their gender, their ethnicity, or their parental socioeconomic status. So for children in particular, we think what is essential is providing universal access to early childhood development, to education, health and nutrition, basic infrastructure services. And this is key to them developing then into being healthy and productive adults, being able to get good jobs, being able to move themselves and their children out of poverty. So what do we mean when we talk about equality of opportunity? You'll see a report that focuses a lot on that question and then attempts to measure it. And ultimately, it really boils down to a very simple idea, which is that access to key fundamental services like clean water, education, sanitation, health should be equal for all children, regardless of where they're born, what gender they are, how much money their parents make, what education their parents have. And unfortunately, equality of opportunity is still very much an aspiration in many countries. I would even say that it's still not there even in quite high-income countries for some groups of the population. Now, I think if we talk a little bit about Africa, and you will see some of this in the report, if we think about a rural child in a place like Mozambique, you'll see that he or she is only about half as likely to have sanitation in the household as an urban child. If we look at a country like Rwanda, which has made progress in many dimensions, but only 20% of the poorest children have clean water at home compared to over 65% of the richest. And these inequalities are not just unfair. As I mentioned, the consequences of these inequalities play themselves out through a child's life and into adulthood. If you're born poor, if you're born a poor girl in a rural area, in a poor country, you can take a country like Nigeria, your chances of going to school are much lower, your chances of having clean water are much lower, you're much more likely to be stunted, much more likely to be sick from preventable diseases, you will probably be less able to go to school continuously, you'll probably learn less, and you will be trapped in a cycle of poverty. And this is, in fact, very much the case. You will see some numbers today that show that in Nigeria, girls, if you have a rural girl, access to a basic bundle of services is less than 20%. If you're thinking about a boy in an urban setting from a richer household, that access to that same bundle is over 80%. So enormous differences that really condition lives and opportunities, starting from the earliest childhood and well into adulthood. Unfortunately, as I said, it's still very far from a scenario where kids have real equality of opportunity, but there has been a lot of progress. And we really are convinced that working on this equality of opportunity sets the stage, levels the playing field for the future, and will be not just the recipe for more equitable societies, but actually also for more productive and richer societies as well. So it's not just a question of
Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started. My name is Theyre Dubovi. I am the Deputy Director of the Global Health Policy Center here at CSIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to do African children have an equal chance? To unveil the Human Opportunity Report from the World Bank. We are going to start out with some opening remarks by Anna Ravenga, who's the Senior Director of the Poverty Global Practice at the World Bank. We are going to have a short introductory video that explains some of the concepts behind this report. We will turn it over to the two report authors, Andrew and Ambar, to walk through the findings and the main messages of the report, and then we will proceed to a panel where we will discuss what these findings mean for a policy audience. And at that point, I will ask a few opening questions, but we're hopeful that you will all participate and ask questions and engage in dialogue. So you have bios of everybody in the handout that you got when you checked in, so I'm not going to walk through all of that now. And I'm going to just turn it over to Anna to get us started.
At the World Bank. I'm really pleased to be here just kicking us off. We are extremely lucky, and I want to start by thanking our host, the CSIS Africa program, for partnering with us and for hosting us in this beautiful room. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion about using our report as background, but really an interesting discussion about equality of opportunity for children in Africa. I want to thank our panelists from Save the Children, from UNICEF, Michael, Ted, and also my own colleague from the World Bank, Chico Ferreira, for agreeing to be on the panel. I think they will share their thoughts with us and motivate what I hope will be a lively discussion. I want to thank all of you who are here, but also those of us who are joining us online. And I think, you know, these days we talk a lot and we hear a lot about income inequality. It's in the news, it's in our conversations. I had my mother ask me whether she should buy and read the Piketty book. I told her it was perhaps a little long, and but it's very much in the news, and yet income inequality, if we focus on outcomes, is something that will always be with us. There will always be differences in what people make. There will always be differences in wealth. Some of it reflect differences in effort, entrepreneurship, or skills. I think what we don't talk as much about, and I think this is one of the things that has been missing, I think, from the recent focus on income inequality, is the much more pernicious kind of inequality that really underlies what we see, which is inequality of opportunity, particularly inequality of opportunity at an early age. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Much of what we see as differences in outcomes at the end of the day start very early in life, and they start with very unequal access to very, very basic services. I think this is one of the most important challenges for policymakers around the world, particularly in poorer countries. And I think our panel, what I'm hoping our panel will do is react a bit to our report, but also really make %
for the inequality of opportunity. In other words, the extent to which that 50% coverage is unequally distributed across groups with different types of circumstances. So depending on the extent of inequality or inequality of opportunity, the human opportunity index is going to be less than 50%. So that's what we mean by coverage corrected for equity. So it's an inequality-sensitive coverage rate. It takes into account coverage and whether it's allocated in an equitable way, where equity is defined in terms of whether the groups defined by the circumstances, gender at birth, let's say household income at birth, location, and so on. So these are the circumstances, and these circumstances define groups across which the inequality is measured. Why do we focus on children? And there are two basic reasons, which are really fundamental reasons. One is, of course, the whole question of mobility, which is that inequality of outcomes today is partly a reflection of inequality of opportunity in the past. No matter how you measure those opportunities, whether you measure it by human opportunity index, whether you use a more expanded definition of opportunities, you can very easily see that a lot of the inequality in outcomes today is a result of inequality of opportunity in the past. So there's a whole aspect of mobility when we talk about people moving out of poverty within and across generations. This is one area we have to focus on, the access to basic services and a broader set of opportunities at birth. And secondly, which is of course related, which is the differences in opportunities during childhood, and especially during early childhood, can have lifelong impacts. And this is a problem. This is a point that James Heckman, famously among many others, have made a number of times. And essentially what you find is that interventions early on in life are even cost efficient, because correcting the inequalities at birth later on is actually much more costly and less efficient. So even if you come from a point of a completely sort of, agnostic point of view of cost efficiency and so on, it makes a lot of sense to focus on children. So here is basically the graphical exposition of the example that Anna was giving, which is to what extent does circumstances matter? And here is a quick visual glimpse. So what we're doing is that we are just estimating the probability of accessing, we're calling it a basic bundle of services, relevant for a particular age group, which in this case is 6 to 11 years. And the bundle of services, it's very basic. It's attending school, improved sources of water and sanitation, and we take 2 different children with contrasting profiles, one a girl of age 6 and 11 living in a rural household, in a poor rural household, and headed by a woman with no years of education, and child B, which has exactly the sort of the opposite profile. And this graph basically shows you what's the difference in probability of accessing a bundle which includes all these 3 services, okay? And you can see that even just focus on one number, which is Malawi. So if child A, which is the more vulnerable child, if this person were to live in Malawi, she's actually better off in terms of access to these services compared to all other countries. But even in Malawi, the difference between her probability of access to this bundle and that of the more fortunate child is as much as 40%. If you go to some of these other countries, it's as high as 85%. So this is just to illustrate how circumstances actually matter. So what we're doing in the study, we are using demographic health services and demographic and health surveys, DHS, and we have, and it includes 20 countries, which account for about 73% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa. We cannot include all because we need a data source which is fairly decent. We covered the period roughly between 1998 and 2008. There's some variation because of data availability.